Before I even tell you what happened in France this week, let me just say, this could completely change how you see the role of religious influence in European politics. I'm Andrew Meat-Rich, former analyst for a state-run media outlet, now an independent journalist, and what I'm about to share may truly surprise you. Reports from French media say that a French-speaking religious leader made alarming remarks about President Macron after France announced it would recognize Palestine as a state. But that's only part of the story. At the same time, high-level discussions within the European Union suggest a proposal to relocate certain groups of migrants to processing centers outside of Europe, with countries like Poland and Germany reportedly among those considering the idea. These developments could reshape the political map of the continent in the coming months. If you value clear, independent reporting over filtered headlines, hit that like button and subscribe. We're building a fact-focused English-speaking news community, and now's the time to be part of it. And now, let's get into the details. Let's start with what happened in France. On July 24th, President Emmanuel Macron announced that France will officially recognize Palestine as a state at the United Nations General Assembly in September. This makes France the largest Western power and the first G7 nation to take this step. Macron sent a letter to Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, confirming this historic decision after Abbas condemned the October 7th Hamas attack and called for hostage releases. But here's where it gets even worse. Israel immediately condemned the move, with Prime Minister Netanyahu saying it rewards terror and creates another Iranian proxy. The United States also strongly rejected Macron's decision, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio calling it reckless and a slap in the face to October 7th victims. Wait until you hear the next part. This announcement triggered an unprecedented response from Jewish extremists. On August 3rd, a French-speaking rabbi named David Daniel Cohen posted a YouTube video launching a furious verbal attack on Macron. The rabbi accused Macron of rewriting history and called the recognition a declaration of war against God. And this is where it gets insane. Cohen didn't stop at criticism. He issued a direct death threat. This French president, he needs to know. He better prepare his coffin, the rabbi declared in the video. French authorities immediately launched a criminal investigation, and the Paris prosecutor's office confirmed they opened a probe into these death threats against the President of the Republic. But here's the shocking twist. While France's chief rabbi condemned these statements as deplorable and intolerable, this incident reveals the dangerous intersection of religious extremism and European politics. Cohen, who reportedly lives in Israel but was never affiliated with any French rabbinical institution, represents a growing trend of foreign religious figures interfering in European domestic politics. The video has since been unlisted, but the damage is done. Just imagine that for a second, a religious leader openly calling for the death of a European head of state over foreign policy decisions. France, with Europe's largest Jewish and Muslim populations, is now caught in a crossfire of international religious and political tensions. You see the pattern, right? If you're still with me, hit that like button. It tells me you want the truth, not just the headlines. But if you think this is bad, wait until you hear what's happening across the European Union with migration policies. While France deals with death threats over Palestine, the entire European Union is quietly implementing a radical new migration strategy that would make your head spin. Danish Immigration Minister Kar Dybvad just revealed that there's enormous support among EU member states for sending asylum seekers to detention centers outside Europe. And now listen carefully. Countries supporting this plan include Germany, France, Poland, and Italy. This isn't some fringe proposal anymore. In May, 15 EU countries signed a letter advocating for what they call return hub mechanisms, where migrants would be transferred to third countries while waiting for deportation. Here's where it gets even worse. Germany is secretly negotiating with Rwanda for a program similar to the failed British scheme that was ruled unlawful by courts. The Netherlands is in talks with Uganda to create transit centers for migrants, and Uganda is a country where LGBTQ people face the death penalty. Let me repeat that. The progressive European Union wants to send vulnerable asylum seekers to a country that executes people for their sexual orientation. Denmark, which pioneered this approach, was the first EU country to openly pursue outsourcing asylum procedures to Rwanda back in 2021. The European Commission initially condemned this as raising fundamental questions about access to protection under international law. But now the entire EU establishment has done a complete 180. What changed? The rise of right-wing parties across Europe has forced even center-left governments to adopt increasingly harsh migration policies. Poland despite being led by the centrist Donald Tusk, maintains conservative migration policies from the previous government. Germany's Alternative for Germany party is surging in polls, forcing the ruling coalition to redefine migration policy with a focus on managing, controlling, and limiting immigration. The hypocrisy is staggering. 3 years ago, Brussels called the UK-Rwanda plan inhumane and a violation of international law. Now they're implementing the exact same policies. This week, Rwanda announced it agreed to accept 250 migrants deported from the United States, proving these African detention centers are becoming a global dumping ground for unwanted asylum seekers. But here's the shocking twist. European taxpayers are funding this moral catastrophe while their own countries face housing crises and economic instability. Italy's Albania centers, Denmark's Rwanda negotiations, and the Netherlands' Uganda talks represent a coordinated effort to externalize Europe's migration challenges to some of the world's poorest countries. You see the pattern, right? Subscribe now, because the next story we cover might hit even closer to home. Here's what this all means, and why you need to stay informed. France is experiencing its worst political crisis in modern history, with Macron's approval rating hitting historic lows of 21%, lower than during the Yellow Vest protests. The country faces a budget deficit of 6.1%, unemployment at 7.6%, and prisons so overcrowded they're considering renting cells in other countries. Meanwhile, the EU's migration outsourcing represents a fundamental shift away from human rights principles toward a transactional approach that treats asylum seekers as commodities to be traded. This isn't just about migration or Middle East politics. This is about the soul of European democracy. When religious extremists can threaten heads of state with impunity, while governments secretly negotiate to dump vulnerable people in African detention centers, we're witnessing the collapse of the liberal democratic order. The connection is clear. Political instability creates space for extremism, both religious and political. What's happening in France and across the EU today will determine whether Europe remains committed to human rights or descends into authoritarian populism. We're building an honest English-speaking news community here because mainstream media won't tell you these uncomfortable truths. Like this video if you want more investigative coverage, subscribe for daily updates, and comment below with your thoughts. What do you think? Comment below.